In November 1957, a woman disappeared in a small, remote town in the UK. Investigators quickly identified a suspect after taking on the case. Around this rural town, there was a man known as the Dragon Wizard, or the Butcher of Plainfield Village. He liked to create all sorts of objects from corpses he could find in surrounding cemeteries. This man's name was Ed Gein, the infamous Devil Butcher, who went down in British history for turning his victims into household items as a sick hobby and pastime. You're following the case of Ed Gein, the Plainfield Village Butcher, and his collection of human skin furniture on the Crime Channel. If this story intrigues you, and you want to hear more true crime cases from around the world, don't hesitate to leave a like as encouragement for us. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on the most fascinating criminal cases. Ed, full name Edward Gein, lived with his mother when he was young. This relationship was closely tied to why he became a devil in human form. He lived on an isolated farm, which provided ample conditions for this sick man to indulge in his hobby of digging up corpses from cemeteries to make furniture. Or perhaps he was just lonely and wanted something to confide in. Either way, it was a horrifying thing for a normal person to do. Like other serial killers, Ed Gein had a typical childhood story that could be seen as a factor leading to his own murders. The story of this sick killer begins on a remote farm where he spent most of his life. It was located in a village called Plainfield in Devonshire, England. On Saturday, November 16, 1957, Plainfield Village was quieter than usual as it was the opening day of the hunting season for the local men. Bernice Worden, owner of a small grocery store, took advantage of this quiet time to tidy up her shop. All the local men were in the forest hunting, so she thought she wouldn't have to open the store as early as usual. But to her surprise, while she was putting away 2 cans of lentils and formaggio, she suddenly saw a man parking in front of the store. Bernice thought it might be one of the hunters needing to buy something. Ed stepped through the parking lot, a gun hidden behind his back, then pushed open the door. Bernice politely greeted him. She recognized him as the seemingly foolish man living on the neighboring farm. He had no ill intentions usually, but Bernice happened to be the one he was targeting. So a robbery occurred at the Plainfield grocery store. Faced with the robber, Bernice asked what he wanted. She didn't have much cash on hand, but if he was hungry or needed anything from the store, he could take it. It was around 5 p.m. Her son Frank had just returned from hunting. He noticed the grocery store door was locked, but strangely, there was still light coming from inside. Frank also discovered his mother's delivery van was missing. He decided to go to the petrol station a few meters away to see if anyone had seen his mother. The petrol station attendant told him they hadn't seen Bernice. The store seemed to have been closed since morning, and no one had seen Bernice in the area. Frank started to panic, but fortunately, he was the deputy sheriff of Plainfield. Frank could quickly alert everyone about his mother's disappearance. He contacted 3 other men in the local police force, including Sheriff Arthur Schley, whose office was 25 kilometers away. Arthur was previously a lorry driver, but at 32, wanting stability, he decided to change careers. Coincidentally, the sheriff position was vacant. It was a good position with decent pay. Arthur got to work in a warm office and no longer had to live a nomadic life. Most importantly, what could possibly happen in a small English village? The search team, including 2 more officers, Elroy Friel and Alan Chase, met in front of Bernice's grocery store and decided to break in. Upon seeing the scene inside the store, Frank immediately understood that his mother had been kidnapped. Worse, he also discovered blood trails leading to the back door, and notably, bullet holes on the wall. Then a more experienced backup force was called in. After checking the counter, they discovered an order for antifreeze with the name Ed Gein. At the moment this name was seen, the police had no idea they were about to take on one of the worst cases Britain had ever faced, even long before the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer appeared. Frank described Ed Gein as an eccentric man living on a farm not far from his and his mother's home. Frank had previously stopped by to ask if he wanted to go hunting together. 2 teams were dispatched to locate Ed Gein. The first team was ordered to search the surrounding area, to see if they could find Bernice or her van. The second group, consisting of Chase and Marty, was ordered to enter the farm. When they arrived at the farm, it looked no different from an abandoned land. Some windows were even covered, making it look more like a slum than a farm. Chase and Marty knocked, but no one answered. Later, Ed Gein was arrested as a suspect, but he didn't utter a word about Bernice. Once again, the police came to the house in the middle of the farm. They saw a door leading to an annex room on the right. As soon as they pushed the door open, a strong, putrid smell wafted up. The further they went, the stronger and more nauseating the smell became. Going through one of the doors, the two men were paralyzed with horror. They saw Bernice there, naked, hanging from the ceiling. Although the body was headless, based on the build and skin, they could immediately recognize it was Bernice. Sheriff Arthur went outside and vomited profusely, nearly fainting. Officer Elliott called for backup to Ed Gein's farm. They entered inside and discovered horrifying truths. For exactly 10 years, this pervert had been exhuming bodies from local cemeteries to make furniture, objects, clothing, and even had fun times with them. Occasionally, on impulse, he would kill people for fresh meat. You're probably wondering how a seemingly normal-looking man could commit such terrible things. To understand why, perhaps we need to go back to Ed Gein's childhood. A tumultuous upbringing. Edward Theodore Gein, known as Ed Gein, was born on August 27, 1906, in the village of Plainfield, Devonshire. From a young age, Ed's life was quite unfortunate. His father, George Philip Gein, was an alcoholic. He was a completely lost soul. He died when Ed was still young. George's parents had been swept away in a flood. He was sent to an orphanage and was adopted by an elderly couple, but they only saw him as a caretaker for their house in their old age. Basically, he hung around there until adulthood. Ed's mother, Augusta, grew up in a very strict and religious family. For many years she was immersed in fanaticism, but George didn't know that this would cause their conflicts to escalate later. He loved her blindly. So the couple had Ed in August 1906. He was the second child, and Henry was the eldest. Unpleasant things happened in Ed's family. George couldn't stand his wife's unreasonable religious fanaticism. He couldn't bear hearing about religion from morning to night. For Augusta, everything was a sin and needed to be prayed for to be cleansed. Her two sons, Henry and Ed, were not allowed to talk to anyone, make noise, or interact with girls or unmarried couples. They had to pray before eating, and of course, the youngest son couldn't escape his mother. Every day, his mother would come to read him a passage from the Bible. The only time Ed prayed with his mother was to pray for the impending death of their alcoholic and violent father. The two of them prayed together by candlelight in front of George's portrait, asking their God to strike him down as soon as possible, quite literally. Imagine coming home after a long day of hard work and finding your wife and child praying for you to disappear from the world. How would you feel? But it seems the prayers had no effect, as George survived despite Augusta's fanaticism. When Ed was 7, Augusta had saved some money from her small business. She owned a butcher shop. With her savings, she bought a farm and wanted to settle the whole family there. She wanted to isolate her family from society as much as possible. She was obsessed with making them believe in religion and be as fanatical as her, but it seems she failed. In Plainfield, every time Ed came home from school, his mother would wait for him with holy water from a spring. She would splash it on his face to wash away all the sins he had committed during the day. She believed that when entering the house, he had to be purified and clean. After that, he would spend most of his free time in his room, reading secret books he brought home so his mother wouldn't confiscate them. Once, Ed was playing with some of his friends in an empty lot when Augusta suddenly rushed over to preach a moral lesson and tell him that friends would lead him into sin. It would all be like hell on earth for him. This fanaticism and confinement lasted until 1940 when Ed's father, George, died of a heart attack at the age of 66. At this point, Ed's mother was overjoyed to have freed her husband from the demon of alcohol and violence. When George died, Henry, the oldest in the family at 38, helped with the farm work. In fact, Henry, the older brother, had found ways to escape his mother's confinement. He still maintained friendships and went out with girls. As for Ed, he was truly trapped on the farm with his father and mother. He was completely confined and psychologically stunted. It's no exaggeration to say that Ed's life was ruined by his own mother. He was an adult, but still looked like a teenager who had never had a relationship with a woman. His mother was the only woman in his life. More disgustingly, the mother began to seduce her son and went to bed with her own child. Henry was horrified when he saw his brother sleeping with their mother. An argument broke out. Henry threatened to report everything to the authorities. But a few weeks later, on May 16, 1944, a fire broke out on the farm. At midnight, the surrounding fields where the family made their living and ate suddenly caught fire. The flames threatened the old building. Ed and Henry were quickly awakened by the bright light of the fire. The two brothers went outside to fill buckets with water to extinguish the fire, but then Henry disappeared. He was found after the fire in the field. The strange thing was that his body was found in the burned field, but there were no burn marks on his body. The police found bruises on his body, but due to a lack of thorough investigation, the cause of Henry's death remained an unsolved mystery. Only 13 years after Ed Gein's case broke out, did investigators discover that Henry's passing might not have been as natural as it seemed, but rather to silence him. So only Ed and his mother Augusta were left living together. Not long after, Augusta suffered a stroke and died at the age of 67, unable to know that this would make Ed more insane than ever. Ed had lost the only woman in his life, his only friend, lover, and mother. Ed watched over his mother's body until she was buried on December 31st in a private funeral with a few relatives. When he returned to the farm on December 31st, 1944, Ed, for the first time in his life, returned alone to this vast, empty house. To ensure that his mother's faith would be respected for centuries to come, he placed ropes, tape, and crosses to keep his mother's soul forever at peace in her room in the house. Alone, Ed's life began to decline and even fall into a state of madness. Ed was alone on the farm with no one by his side. His parents and brother had died, and he found himself left alone. Although 35 years had passed, he had been in the cocoon of his family for too long, completely unaware of what to do next. Lost on the farm, Ed always felt like he was being watched. He thought he was going crazy. Ed saw his mother's face everywhere, thinking she would talk to him or read the Bible to him like when he was young. Later, Ed began reading things related to death and the mystical world. Occasionally, he came across stories about cannibalism. Ed read articles about the horrors of World War II, which at that time were still being broadcast and reported through newspapers and radio. That was the only thing that interested him. These things gradually made the killer more callous towards the horrific crimes he would later commit. Ed seemed to have no awareness of his crimes. Normally, Ed did odd jobs to make money. He was known as the country fool. Everyone called him an idiot. He looked at girls strangely when he worked in town. Then he would return to his farm in the evening as usual. But people seemed to sympathize with his looks because they felt sorry for him. Many times during his crisis, he tried to summon his mother's spirit, but she never appeared. What led him to start exhuming bodies was when Ed read a story about an aristocratic club that existed in the previous century. This club had formed a cult to exhume the bodies of young girls from local cemeteries and then abuse these unfortunate girls together. It was these stories that fueled the perverted desires in Ed's heart. He told himself it would be better to go find recently buried young women, and that would be like having a pet horse on his farm. How to know which young women were recently buried? Simple. Just regularly read the obituary section of Plainfield and go to the cemetery at midnight, and he set about his work. He confessed that finally he would have girlfriends and no longer be lonely. He kept digging until he saw the coffin, then went down into the hole, opened the wooden box, and took the body away. She really was a young woman, as in the Plainfield obituary. Ed hurriedly returned home, more excited than ever. From that moment, Ed isolated himself to live 10 more years among the corpses. With his first victim, he performed some experiments. He experienced what he had read on their bodies. At first, he abused his victims until their bodies began to decompose. So to preserve the bodies he considered his only friends, Ed began to strip off the skin and then sun-dry it. He worked on different pieces of skin for many hours, and then created all kinds of objects that we know about later. When the bodies had decomposed too much, Ed scattered them around the farm. After his first successful expedition to the cemetery, Ed didn't stop. Later, he said he targeted 3 other cemeteries, mainly in the area around Plainfield. Indeed, his method of operation had been well established. It took 10 years before the police discovered it, so it could be said that he wasn't as foolish as rumored. He continued to read the obituaries, go to the cemetery, dig up graves, and bring the bodies home. There were even times when he was quite busy because, after all, he still had to earn some money. Ed kept all his beauties at home and wisely waited for the weekend. He considered it his little relaxation time. He would take the new bodies out of the large bag, place them on the sofa in the living room, and have a little aperitif with them, talking about his week. The conversations never had any response. And when winter came, he told himself it was a bit cold, and having a second skin would be great. Instead of creating objects with the victims, he sewed himself a pair of trousers from their skin. Later, he stated that his house was always heated with the fireplace on high so that the victim's skin wouldn't get goosebumps. The worst part was that Ed didn't even hide his creations. There was a small corner where children liked to play outside in the surrounding grounds of the farm, from where they could see inside. Sometimes they came to knock on his door, for instance, to ask for a glass of water or a snack. Some children would leave Ed's house heavily shocked and tell their parents that they saw heads placed on furniture and that the house was haunted with people who didn't speak or move, placed on sofas or hung on hooks in the laundry room, exactly what the police later discovered. But no one believed the children. They thought perhaps the kids were just making up stories. Ed Gein, the local fool, he would never hurt a fly. Perhaps he just didn't know how to maintain his house properly. Imagine the faces of the parents when they finally discovered that their children had never lied, and when they saw with their own eyes the images inside Ed's farm. They probably had to move house somewhere else. By now, you probably know who Ed Gein is. Why is he so famous in British history? He even had a nipple belt that he made for himself, or designed his own skull helmet. But above all, if Ed is so famous, it's because he wore a second hat, the hat of a serial killer. Back to the farm at the time he was discovered, the entire small town of Plainfield fell into a state of chaos and extreme horror at this pervert. Never before had there been so many people in this area. About 100 journalists came from all over the country, and at that time, no one knew that most of the skin and objects found came from local graves. According to lists found on various websites, at Ed's farm they found a wastebasket made of human skin, skulls on bedside tables, bowls and cutlery made of stretched human skin lampshades, a belt made of human nipples. But what particularly worried the investigators working on Ed Gein's case was that he had lied when he claimed that everything found on his farm came from surrounding cemeteries, and that he hadn't killed any victims himself. This was highly implausible because they found dried and preserved female genitals in his house. Although in the 10 years prior, no young girls or teenagers had died in the area, some had been reported missing. Georgette Wickler, 8 years old, disappeared on May 1, 1947, on her way home from school. No screams, no blood, nothing, except for tire tracks from a Maxwell car matching the one Ed had driven. In October 1953, Evelyn Hartley, 15 years old, disappeared one evening after babysitting. After putting the children to bed, she vanished without a trace. Her shoes and glasses were found on the floor. Only the back door of the basement was unlocked that evening. Later, her blood was found on the door and even in the garden. From that evening on, she was never seen again. What made investigators believe he might be lying was that he wouldn't admit to anything unless there was concrete evidence. For example, the case of Mary Hogan, who disappeared on December 8, 1954, while working at the local pub. The case of Bernice Worden, the woman who suddenly vanished while no customers were present in the pub. Blood was found on the ground with empty shotgun shells, and a blood trail led to the car park. At first, Ed said he knew nothing until Mary's dried head was discovered at his house. He wasn't as foolish as people often said. Psychiatrists who examined his case declared that Ed Gein had a completely normal IQ, even above average, at least 100. But he suffered from untreated schizophrenia for many years, sometimes accompanied by hallucinations. This is why he often felt like his mother was talking to him, or paying attention to him. Notably, according to experts, he could hardly distinguish between right and wrong from the start. Everything he did was just who he was. He only confessed to murder when there was evidence. Although human remains found in Ed Gein's house didn't come from cemeteries, including a complete skeleton of a young girl missing only the head, investigators couldn't identify her when Ed refused to confess to anything. When interrogated, he always blamed others. He attacked Bernice, the grocery store owner, because she looked like his mother, and he wanted her in his house. He said that if he did these terrible things, it was all because no one had ever cared about him. After 10 more years of psychiatric treatment, in 1958, Ed was finally declared fit to stand trial, and doctors now considered him mentally competent. The trial would take place without a jury, at the request of Ed's lawyer, as anyone could declare him guilty before hearing the prosecution and defense. The news was reported in all media surrounding Ed's case. Ed was eventually convicted and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a mental institution. On July 26, 1984, at 72 years old, he died of respiratory failure. Ed Gein died, taking with him the secrets of his true number of victims. The exact number of victims Ed Gein may have caused in 10 years has never been brought to light because he was one of those serial killers who didn't officially confess to anything without concrete evidence. What do you think about the story of this infamous killer in British history? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below so we can discuss further. And before you go, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated on the most intriguing and fascinating cases on the True Crime channel.